Why don't we get started? Welcome to the Communication and Cultural Policy in the Age of the Platform Conference. I want to start by acknowledging that McMaster is situated on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And right now I'm on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I think it's also important for us to acknowledge the roles that communication and cultural policy and technologies play in the oppression and erasure of Indigenous peoples, and also, as Jesse Wente pointed out Monday, in creating both settler and also Indigenous nations. Jesse Wente invited us on Monday to consider how we might further the goals of narrative sovereignty in Indigenous peoples, for Indigenous peoples, of Indigenous peoples. I'm Sarah Bannerman, Canada Research Chair in Communication Policy and Governance at McMaster University, and I'm one of the organizers of this conference with Tamara Shepherd at the University of Calgary and David Ogborn here at McMaster, along with a whole host of other people around McMaster and beyond who have been crucial supporters of this conference. I particularly want to thank the Socrates Project, funded through the generous donation of Chancellor Emeritus Linton Red Wilson, for its support of our keynote speakers and this conference, along with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, McMaster's Faculty of Humanities, the network, the Center for Networked Media and Performance, along with the Networked Imagination Laboratory, the University of Calgary Faculty of Arts, the Department of Communication Studies and Multimedia at McMaster, the Indigenous Studies Program at McMaster, McMaster School of the Arts, and McMaster's Department of Political Science. This session is being recorded and it will only be shared publicly according to participants' agreements with us. And most of those recordings will be made available in an online conference archive, and we'll announce that to participants when it's ready. We've got a number of different events ahead today. We're starting off the day today with a keynote talk by Joan Jenkinson, the Executive Director of the Black Screen Office. That'll be followed after a short break by a keynote panel with all of our keynote speakers, including Joan Jenkinson, Jesse Wente, Sharon McGowan, and Susan Brinton. Unfortunately, Edward Greenspan is not able to join us today. That will be followed by a closing session led by Tamara Shepherd and Dana Kramer. Tamara and David will facilitate a discussion resulting in a set of policy recommendations that will emerge from the panels and keynotes that we've had throughout the conference. We'll end the day at 3:50 when Darlene Laforme of the Cayuga Turtle Clan will close off the conference for us with the traveling song and some words of encouragement as we seek to capture the learnings from this conference and carry them forward. It's now my pleasure to introduce Joan Jenkinson, the Executive Director of the Black Screen Office. She works to support Black Canadians in developing talent, accessing funding, and in assuming decision-making roles in television, film, and digital media. She fosters relationships with federal funding agencies, broadcasters, and distributors to eliminate anti-Black racism within the screen industries. She's a founding partner and producer at Artemis Pictures, which is focused on developing and producing high-end scripted content for television and cinema and for international audiences. She was the vice president of independent production at Zoomer Media Limited, the television division, where she commissioned, developed, and executive produced hundreds of hours of award-winning creative content in all genres for Vision TV. She spearheaded Vision TV's groundbreaking Diverse TV NSI initiative, which produced award-winning comedy and drama programs, and which earned her a Visionary Award from the Real World Film and the Film Festival. For 5 years, Joan also served as the Executive Director of Women in Film and Television Toronto, where she established professional development training and networking opportunities for women in screen-based media. We'll have some time after Joan's talk for, I think, a good session of Q&A. So do please think of your questions and comments And please do put those in the chat whenever you're ready, and we'll call on those after the talk is finished. Joan, what a pleasure and what an honor it is to have you here today. I'm really looking forward to your talk, so thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate all the work that you and your team have done. Now it seems probably for many, many months to get us here. And I'm really delighted to be invited and to be among so many interesting and distinguished guests. And I'm happy to be spending time with our viewers today. For me, the heart of communications and cultural policy is storytelling. My mother was a great storyteller. She could make the most mundane incident spellbinding. She instilled in me my love of story, and it stayed with me throughout my career. After graduating from high school, I found that even when it wasn't in my job description, I always landed in a situation where I was creating screen content or helping others to bring their stories to life. So it's been very much a through line for me. And being at the Black Screen Office is certainly a continuation of that passion. There have been some really informative and insightful talks this week about cultural policy. And while I am thrilled to be invited to participate, I did have a moment of panic about what it is that I would say. I felt that I'm here to represent the Black Screen Office. I should have something specific to say about the Black community and cultural policy. But the fact is, we've been advocating for policies within the screen industries to remove systemic barriers for years and years. And now finally, there's some movement in that direction, but there's a long way to go. And we're still talking about what to do instead of actually doing it. So for me, the end result that I want to see is that the Black community would be on the legislative agenda. And I personally feel that we should be coming together to create a national policy for media, arts, culture, and heritage. But before we can get there, I think we need to know, I'd like to talk to you a bit more about what the current reality is. And to do that, it goes way back. Like the history of anti-Black racism in Canada is unique and extensive, yet this history has been glossed over and largely erased. Many Canadians are unaware that over 200 years of slavery have been woven into the fabric of this country, and that it significantly affected the quality of life for Black Canadians. Poverty rates in Black Canadian families are 8 to 24% higher than the national average. Black women in Ontario earn 57 cents for every dollar that a white man earns. And 44% of Black children in Toronto live in poverty. And let's not forget that Black people are still 20 times more likely than white people to be shot dead by police. So the global problem of racism is rooted in anti-Black racism, which has resulted in the worst outcomes for Black Canadians. And we've seen time and time again that when Black people fall under the umbrella of visible minorities or BIPOC, the assumption is that there'll be equal opportunity for everyone within the group. But that's certainly not the case. Under the catch-all label of BIPOC, Black people get the least attention and resources and the worst outcomes. So the current reality for Black Canadians working in the screen-based media sector is that there are unfair policies and practices that have disenfranchised and discriminated against the community. And these practices and policies are deeply embedded. So, but Black professionals have a desire to work within the screen industries at all levels, from writing and directing to technical positions. There's an array of opportunities for financial prosperity in this industry. And we're talking like a multi-billion-dollar industries that many racialized people have been locked out of for many reasons, which I'll get into later. But one of the main reasons is that the gatekeepers, decision makers, unions and boards of directors that head these organizations and institutions have virtually no Black representation. So in the history of Canada, only 4 TV series made by and about Black people have ever made it to air, and 1 comedy series. And on the side of film, it's taken on average 10 years between feature films for Black filmmakers to make their next one. These films that you see on the screen were made 10 to 13 years ago, and it took 10 years later to actually make another film, which I find a real shocking thing. In Quebec, it's far worse. Only 2 series about Black Canadians have ever been made it to air, and those were web series that were seen on Radio-Canada. So in July of 2020, a group of the senior people, Black people in the industry got together around the time of the Black Lives Matters protests after the murder of George Floyd. And we got together to talk about what our experience has been of anti-Black racism as we've gone through the trenches in the film industries and have landed where we are today. And at that time, there are a number of companies, organizations, and individuals making statements about what they were going to do to help eradicate racism, and particularly anti-Black racism. So we thought to ourselves, well, what do we want to do, and what do we have to say? So we wrote a letter, an open letter, to the Minister of Canadian Heritage, asking him to meet with us to discuss how we can work together to eliminate anti-Black racism in the screen industries. And that did lead to a couple of meetings with the minister. And following that, we had a meeting with Telefilm Canada, where they pledged support on an annual basis for the Black Screen Office. And it was through years and years of advocacy and these efforts over the last few months that has brought the Black Screen Office into being. And that happened in November 2020. So we're all of 5 months old. So our mission at the Black Screen Office is to support Black Canadians working throughout the screen industries. We want to help them build their careers, strengthen their networks, but ultimately it all comes back to story. We want to see our stories not only being made, but exhibited here in Canada and internationally. And to do that, we feel that we have to work to transform the policies and practices within the industry. And that starts with advocacy. We've seen in the last couple of weeks that the government has really stepped up for the Indigenous community, and has Jesse Winting spoke to us about on Monday. Their work for narrative sovereignty is now finally getting some attention. And while the Black community has no claim to sovereignty, we do want equity and inclusion. And we feel that it has to be legislated for it to really have any effect. So while the organization started in the midst of, a global awakening about anti-Black racism and anti-oppression, moving forward, the Black Screen Office wants to be about hope and change. We want to work towards long-lasting equity and inclusion for Black Canadians working in the screen industries. We're also working on other issues like Black ownership of intellectual property. For years and years and years, Black producers have had to give up the IP of their projects because they were told that they didn't have enough experience and that they didn't have the credibility to make the shows that they had developed and produced themselves. And this is further exacerbated now with the streamers coming in, that it's not only Black-owned companies and producers that are having issues with IP, but all producers now that streaming services are coming in, bringing a lot of work here, but not allowing producers to keep their IP. We're also really interested in exploring the issue of intersectionality for Black women. We've seen that when there are initiatives that deal with racial equity, Black women fare the worst. And when we're dealing with gender equity and gender parity, Black women are barely an afterthought and also have the worst outcomes. We're starting with data. One of the first things we want to do is to do a market intelligence survey of who the Black people are within the industry, where they live, the kinds of jobs that they're doing, what levels are they at? Are they emerging, mid, or experienced? Are there some people who are trying to get in who are facing barriers? We want to get a really deep understanding of the community that we're serving, because if we don't know who they are, then we won't know what they need. But once we started talking about doing this market intelligence survey, other people started to say, well, we need that information as well. There are different agencies and organizations within screen industries that are developing programs for inclusion and representation. But if we don't know who the community and the people in it are, then how are we going to make those programs targeted and effective? This past week, we launched a study called Being Seen: Directives for Creating Authentic and Inclusive Content. And we're going across the country doing consultations and finding out from racialized LGBTQ and people with disability communities what their directives are for the industry, for creators, producers, broadcasters, and funders, and the people who evaluate whether projects should get made. We want them to tell us what is representative and inclusive and respectful of their communities. And the third study that we hope to launch in the not too distant future is one about the national, it's a national race-based audience survey. While a quarter of the Canadian population, or close to a quarter, are racialized and Indigenous people, and in major urban centers, they are close to 50% in some, and in others more than 50%. We know absolutely nothing about this audience. Advertisers are not aware, people who market content don't know how to market to them. And our concern is that now that there's some interest in creating Black content and content for people of color and Indigenous people, that they'll be made in a vacuum. Marketers will not know how to find those audiences. Advertisers will have no incentive to buy airtime on those shows. So we want to, through this study, really open up the eyes of the country, basically, to these invisible communities when it comes to screen media. And we hope to really make a dent in the ecosystem, like to bring the ecosystem actually together to make really informed decisions based on real data, so that the programs that are being made will have an opportunity for success. The Black Screen Office is also helping to cultivate pipelines of talent to open up the doors and make connections for Black screen professionals to work with Canadian broadcasters, but also with American streamers, studios, and networks who now have their own inclusion and diversity departments who tie to the creative side of the business, who are looking to us to see how we can work together. And then we want to connect our content creators to resources so that they can take advantage of those opportunities. There's been a lot of talk this week about digital platforms, and they do hold a lot of promise, especially those that are shooting content in Canada. They're bringing a lot of opportunities and jobs to technical and crew people who work on sets. And we're finding that the US producers are demanding that Black, Indigenous, people of color work on their shows. But while, I think when Canada is being sold to the US and we're being talked about as this great multicultural country, which we are, those producers are not able to find the crews that they need because there have been so many barriers to access in the system among unions and guilds that everybody's scrambling right now to get people in and to train them up, but it's an uphill battle. But again, the digital platforms are creating jobs. They're helping to actually push the agenda of inclusivity, and they're also creating jobs for actors in minor roles. But with that comes threat. That of course, their programs are being made, but while they have Canadians in them, they're not Canadian content. And if this continues, we won't be any further ahead because Black-owned companies, but also all companies, will not be able to hold on to their IP, which automatically flows to the streaming services if you want to work with them. So we need, as an industry, to work together to come up with legislation that is going to clear the path to helping us to build our own Canadian industry and for us to have Black companies flourish. So the Black Screen Organization is working towards being a thriving national organization. We want to be a unified force for Black Canadians working throughout the industry to build a community, a place where they feel safe and where they'll be supported. We also want to be a part of the ecosystem of Black-led organizations and racial equity organizations within the sector. Many people are doing a lot of good work, and we want to work together to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts, but that we are really advancing the cause of equity and inclusion. And we're also building strong networks of allies and advisors, industry partners, including funders, unions, guilds, and associations, because again, there's so much work to be done and we really need it. We need to do it together to really move forward. We are unapologetically by and for Black Canadians. We believe that there's a lot of power of leadership and talent in this country. We're empowering. We recognize that we need to nurture the power that's already there so that we can create opportunities and shape our own destiny. And we're visionary. We have a healthy disregard for the impossible. We refuse to accept the status quo and believe that there are no limits to what Black Canadians can accomplish in screen industries. With the few opportunities that we've had, Black-led companies have created opportunities that have launched the careers of actors who've gone on, to make programming and content not only in Canada, but in the United States. And we've also produced some great directors like Stephen Williams, who was one of the directors of Lost and was the executive producer and director of Watchmen, among many other talented individuals who really got their start from Black-run organizations. So So just in wrapping up, I'd like to say that, right now we're part of a racial reckoning. Canada's cultural industries and institutions have made a commitment to remove systemic barriers. In fact, there are policies and practices that are being developed within the screen industries. They're being designed through a lens of equity and inclusion. And there's a lot of money being thrown around at the problem, and it's been exacerbated by COVID, which has also, um, uh, you know, um, created a need for money within the system to keep it flowing and growing. But we don't know if these things are sustainable. We don't know if they're being strategic. And what the Black Screen Office is advocating for is a big picture strategy that ensures sustainability. It's a strategy that's embedded in our government and institutions and in legislation, because we want to be a part of the cultural policy conversation. And I think this will mean for the Canadian government that they can finally make good on the promise of multiculturalism, and where they've promised that there would be equity for all Canadians in their economic, social, cultural, and political life. And I personally want to see a national policy that embraces um, culture, Black culture, arts, and heritage. And I would love to see us fulfill the commitment to the United Nations International Decade of People of African Descent. So for me, it all comes back to story. We want to tell stories, we want to entertain and inspire audiences globally, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done for us to get to that place. So again, thank you so much for your invitation and for being here, and for Sarah and her team, who have been very welcoming and have made it possible for us to get our issues on the agenda.
Thank you so much, Joan. That was terrific. That was wonderful. I loved especially how you emphasized the healthy disregard for the impossible and the vision of a national strategy of Black culture, arts, and heritage. So thank you for a wonderful talk. I want to invite people to put questions and comments in the chat, or to put up your hand if there's a question that you have, your virtual hand using the Zoom hand tool. I'll keep an eye out for all of that, and try to facilitate those questions and comments. Actually, there's two things I'm interested, while we're waiting for some comments to come in, Joan, two things I'm interested in kind of hearing you talk more about. One is the relationship and the difference between the Black Screen Office and the Indigenous Screen Office. And another is I'm interested in hearing more about your thoughts and kind of strategies or the specific shapes, if it's possible at this stage to discuss that, of some of the IP ownership legislation or provisions that you're thinking about. I'm really interested in learning more about that.
Okay, I'll start with the Indigenous Screen Office. We're really thrilled to be, in conversation with them. They work in solidarity, and Jesse and Carrie, who's the co-director of the Indigenous Screen Office, have been so helpful to us as we've started. The Indigenous Screen Office has been for years advocating, obviously, for narrative sovereignty, and have come a long way. And in the last, in the federal budget that was just passed, they were able to finally get the recognition and the funding they need to establish narrative sovereignty. The Black Screen Office in no way claims sovereignty in any way, but what we are demanding is equity and inclusion. And we want to follow the path of the Indigenous Screen Office in terms of getting on the legislative agenda and to be recognized as a community that needs the kind of support that's different from the Indigenous Green Office, but no less important. And so your other question about IP, it's a huge issue right now. As I mentioned, for Black creators in the past, it's just been impossible for them to hold on to their IP. Because they've been told that they don't have enough experience or that they don't have the credibility to, to run with the shows that they've developed and produced. And now with the, sorry, my phone's going off. I thought I turned it off. We'll just ignore it. But with the streaming services coming in, it's been a major issue because they have so much money to spend and so much content that they want to make that it's very attractive for Canadian producers to take the projects that they've developed and produce and have the IP flow to these streaming services. But in effect, what it makes them is service producers for their own productions. And there's no opportunity to exploit their content beyond that initial sale with the streaming service.
Okay, thank you so much. And such an important issue relating to the IP there and being able to retain that. There's a few questions coming in now in the chat. Sharon McGowan has asked, has said, thank you so much for your insightful, informative talk. Can you describe a little bit about the funding of the Black Screen Office and if it's enough to secure and accomplish your goals?
I think one of the reasons why we want to be on the legislative agenda is for one of those reasons that we don't have core funding. We don't have, we have some core funding from Telefilm Canada, but it's certainly not enough to run an organization. And we do spend a lot of our time fundraising to keep going. We're only 5 months in, but I've spent so much time fundraising that it would be great just to spend time and do the work. So we are looking for core funding so that we can, move on with things. We certainly don't have enough right now.
Thank you. Another question has come in from Kathy Allison, who said that she loved what you said about if we don't know who they are, then we don't know what they need. And she's asking what stage is the BSO at in terms of creating a database of artists and creators, as well as a catalog of works that have been created by Black producers in Canada. And actually there's a few questions about that. There's another one that Daniel Keys has asked. Thanks for talking about your inspiring and important work. I was wondering if you could talk about the online database filmandcolor.ca that has 4,500 BIPOC industry members after launching last year. Does your office support this group's grassroots work? I noticed that you mentioned wanting to avoid duplicating effort. So.
Yeah, we're definitely not making a database. There are a few out there, including Higher BIPOC and Access Real World that are doing that, and also the Directors Guild and some of the unions have really good databases. So we will direct our community to those places. We don't see the need to duplicate those efforts. But what we are talking about in doing our market intelligence survey is to find out, where are the communities of Black people across the country. I did a talk for Manitoba All Access Conference, and after the talk, I had about 6 or 7 producers in Winnipeg get a hold of me and say, thank God you're there, because we've been here so isolated. And it's just great to know that there's a national organization that we can become a part of. And so that I think is, a really important function. The other thing that we're doing is focusing a lot on research and advocacy. And on the other side of things, there are a lot of professional development, training programs, mentorships, networking initiatives that are all fantastic. A lot of them are aimed at emerging content creators. Um, so emerging people are definitely part of the Black Screen Office community. But what we are hoping to do is to create opportunities that are real world opportunities for mid-level and senior content creators to get real money to make real product. And we're having actually Canadian broadcasters and American streaming services and networks and studios coming to us to say, how can we work together? So those are the opportunities that we are looking to expand and explore, to, again, to get paid for your work and to recognize that, we can't be perpetually training. We actually need to be working. I think there was another part to the question that I might have forgotten.
Okay, if there was, I've forgotten as well, but I thought that covered it. If not, feel free to put in the chat or speak out if those people who have put in these questions. In the meantime, I'll just put another couple questions that we've received out. Paula Gardner at McMaster has asked about the size of the BSO and its funding. Again, do you have enough staff, or are you kind of limited in terms of the budget restrictions? And you've certainly talked about a number of the pressing priorities that you've got in front of you, and Paul is just asking about those. What are your next pressing priorities? My colleague Tamara Shepard, who's one of the organizers, has also asked, thank you so much, Joan, for your talk. There's so much here to think about. I was wondering if you could expand on the ideas you and the BSO have for improving some of the stats you mentioned, such as the one where you said it takes 10 or more years for Black filmmakers to make a second feature.
Okay, hopefully I'll remember all of those. The first one about, so I think everyone has to remember that we're only 5 months old. Although we have a big agenda and a lot of things that we want to do, we certainly need to do more work in laying the foundation of getting core funding so that we can move forward. We do have a big agenda. We think that it does start with data, so that's why we're making a priority of the 3 studies that we're doing, and they will pretty much be overlapping because we just think that it's urgent to, first of all, know who our community is, and second, to know who our audience is, and third, once we do get our content on air, we want to make sure that it's authentic and inclusive and really representative of our communities. I'm sorry, what was Tamara's question again?
Well, she was asking about the sort of 10 plus years that it takes to get to the second film and the strategies for, I guess, speeding that up.
Yeah. So it's shocking, really, still to me, but we are working with Telefilm Canada to change some of their policies that they've had in place that really had embedded in them severe systemic issues. One of them was a success index that awarded producers who had a certain amount of success, like about 15 years ago, to continue to have access to a pool of funding that would give them priority over anyone that was entering the system. So over the past 15 years, these producers have made, used millions and millions of taxpayer dollars to continue to make their films and to build their companies, while others have been locked out. So Telefilm is completely dismantled that system and is looking at rebuilding it. But all of these things take a long time. We don't, see these changes overnight, but we do see at Telefilm the recognition of the systemic barriers that there have been, and really working towards bringing that gap down. And another thing that Telefilm's done is they've created a racialized stream where Black and people of color can go to have their projects developed. So it's an annual call for projects, and it's a start. I think a lot more needs to be done, but at least it's a foot in the door that we didn't have before. And on the TV side, again, I'm always shocked by this. It's not even a statistic, because you can count on one hand the fact that there have been 4 TV series, dramas, and 1 comedy series in the entire history of Canadian television. There is only room for improvement. And most of those were done by the CBC, so the other broadcasters certainly need to step up. And we're hearing talk now about creating more content. I know for a fact that, the 4th TV drama that was made by and about Black people is now on its 3rd season with CBC, and called Digstown. And another one is in production right now called The Porter, again, another CBC program. So certainly more can be done at the CBC, but the other broadcasters are not even in the game yet.
Another question that's been submitted, what are some things you'd like to see other screen organizations do to support the BSO in the policy work and in the need for funding?
So we work with a number of different groups who are part of what we call an industry transformation group, and the Indigenous Screen Office is part of that group. The Racial Equity Media Collective, Impact, several organizations that are involved with racial equity. And we work in solidarity with each other and really make an effort to not duplicate efforts. One of the things I hope to do soon is to collect all the, have a directory of all the professional development programs and services that are being offered across the country. Some of them are really excellent, and we want to make sure that our community has access to them rather than duplicating them. So there is a lot of talk. I hear, why are there so many of you? And my response is like, why are there so many white organizations? And it's like there's so much to be done, and different people have different priorities, and I think everybody has the right to work towards their objectives. So as far as the legislative agenda and the advocacy that we want to see with the Black Screen Office, we are not only working with the racial equity groups, but we're also working with the funders like Telefilm and CMF and associations like the Canadian Media Producers Association to have roundtables and focus groups and working groups where we can move the agenda forward.
We've got another question here. Thank you for the fantastic talk. What is the reception of Telefilm's changes to its policies and its implementation of the stream for racialized persons? Same question for the CMF's pilot program for racialized communities. Are established white media producers pushing back, or are they embracing the change?
Well, the change at Telefilm with the success index, there was certainly a huge pushback on that, with the claim that these producers who have had this privileged positions are the ones who are making films that travel internationally, and they're the ones who know how to make the business profitable. when in fact that isn't the case. I mean, there are a few examples that are cited that are successful, but but overall, we can't say that those films have made a return on investment. So there was a big pushback when that was being discussed, and a conversation happening through the media. As far as the other initiatives, the racialized stream at both Telfil and CMF, I haven't really heard any pushback. I'm expecting to at any point, but it really hasn't. It really hasn't come to light yet. There's often jokes about it's not a great time to be a white man right now because there is a lot of focus on equity and inclusion, and but yes, so there we haven't heard much.
In some of the things that you're saying, like I kind of hear almost like two approaches or a mix of approaches. Like there's on one hand, there's the whole policy initiatives, legislative policy, funding and stuff. And then on the other hand, you also talked about kind of like marketing and knowing the audience and having that ability to market Black and racialized content. So can you talk a bit about the mix of those two things? Do you kind of lean one way or the other in terms of where you might place your emphasis, or is it really just full steam on both tracks? Are they interrelated, or how do you see that?
Yeah, we're trying to do both because both are really important. I think for a lot of people, legislation is dry. Advocacy is a dry thing. So you can be doing a lot and nobody really appreciates what's happening because you can't really see it, and it's a long-term thing. But I think the Black community, is really hungry to have their stories made and seen. And we, as I said, there are people coming to us with opportunities. I should mention that we're doing something with Bell Media, which is one of their first projects that's dealing with working with French and English writers in one project coming together. Because one thing I haven't spoken much about is the dire straits that Black Francophone content creators are in. They are 20 years behind anything that might be happening here now. And there's still a denial that there's anti-Black racism there, and such a divide between what's considered the immigrant community and the mainstream community. And as I've said, they've had nothing made that's gone to air on mainstream French broadcasters. And there are other initiatives like Story Hive that's run by TELUS, who this year have decided to have a Black edition of Story Hive. And as I've said, I've been speaking to studios and streamers like Amazon, NBC Universal, Sony, Warner Media, who are coming to us and saying, we want to work with you. We know that there's talent in this country, so let's bypass all the obstacles and let's just go right to making content. And we certainly don't want to pass up those opportunities.
And tied to that question, I guess with there's the policy side, and now I want to ask you about numbers. On the policy side, one thing, and Sharon McGowan and Susan Brinton were talking about their efforts under WIF through WIF to kind of create, to have a policy of transparency reporting and diversity reporting on the part of broadcasters. So there's those kind of mandated numbers or numbers that are produced through policy efforts. And then there's also the kind of audience metrics type of numbers. audience metrics and audience measurement done by Numerous and other companies like that. How important are numbers to the whole project? And you've talked a little bit about this already, but how do you see the importance of these different kind of data efforts and efforts to use numbers to achieve better representation and in the screen industry for Black people?
Well, first of all, we have no numbers, like, at all. So, as I've said, when we're talking about audiences, we have no numbers. The Numerous system for collecting audience data doesn't capture anything by race. It's gender and region, age, the usual demographics. But like, literally, we have nothing. We need to start from scratch, and that's why we've started with research to start gathering those numbers. And we're working with Telefilm and CMF to even come up with terms that the various communities are comfortable with in terms of how they will be categorized. And we need to do that really, really basic fundamental work before we can even start gathering statistics of any kind. And I know, several months ago, Telefilm was asked for numbers, like how many of your staff are racialized people, how many projects have been funded or made, and none of that information was available at all. So we're starting from ground zero, and there is, again, just so much work to be done. And without those numbers, it's really difficult to make those policies because, again, we don't know who we're making them for.
I agree, and it's so interesting. And I personally, I don't think I have a full grasp on what Numerous is or how it's working or how in the future it'll work. It sounds so complicated with so many different screens and ways of measuring now. So there must be so much going on there that I'm quite interested in. Just to give you a couple questions as well that I'm also interested about. And not that you have to answer both or anything like that, but whatever you're interested in. Bill C-10, the new Broadcasting Act reform. I'm aware of draft policy direction to the CRTC that I guess was drafted to kind of accompany the new broadcasting revisions that would extend, partly that would extend the Broadcasting Act into the internet. And the measures that directs the CRTC to hold engagement sessions with racialized and ethnocultural groups. I'm quoting from it here. How optimistic or do you have any thoughts on C-10 and the draft policy direction that was put out a little while ago, belatedly? And I was also kind of interested in the barriers that you mentioned in unions and guilds, and whether you could talk a bit more about that.
Well, as far as Bill C-10 goes, there are a lot of really great things in it that will serve to modernize the whole system. I think, again, what they've been, the work that they've done with the Indigenous community is really extraordinary, to finally see all these years of advocacy to see the Indigenous Screen Office particularly to be on the agenda and to get $40 million of funding over the next 3 years to advance their agenda of narrative sovereignty. But the disappointing thing in Bill C-10 is that there really is no legislative agenda for underrepresented groups, not only racialized groups, but LGBTQ+ and people with disability. There are some soft suggestions, but nothing that really has any teeth to it. And so moving forward, as the bill is being leading up to being passed, we're still having those conversations where we're saying, you know, we need to do more. It's not enough to say, well, we've done the Indigenous now, so you wait your turn, and next time around we'll look at you, because that's what happens. That's what happens with you know, Black women when we look at the Women in View study that Sharon McGowan mentioned. I was shocked when I looked at those graphs that they had in the report, where the efforts that have been made for gender equity, you can see there's, you know, they've gone a ways on up the graph, but Black, Indigenous, and people of color women are barely registering, like between 0 and 2% of, you know, in terms of getting positions in on jobs, on films and TV shows within the industry. So again, those things are not really being addressed in a way that we feel is fulsome and that will bring about any significant changes in the short term. We are relying heavily on Telefilm and CMF and other funding agencies to filter what they're doing through the lens of equity and inclusion, and you know, working as closely as we can with them to ensure that there is diversity, equity, and inclusion in the system. As far as Numeris goes, I mean, it's a mystery, I think, to everyone. It is a complicated business. And I think, you know, up to this point,
would you mind just saying, for those who don't know what it is, if you would you mind just saying just an intro to what that is?
So Numeris is the organization that is responsible for ratings data for TV shows. They basically measure the audiences for individual shows, and so, as I said, they don't have any data that's related to racialized and Indigenous communities. So although they say that they are captured in the sample, we don't know, you know, what the proportions are, and you know, where are they counting, and is it in the places where these communities are centered? We don't have any of that information. And the ratings data is just so critically important, because that is what advertisers rely on when they're buying airtime. And broadcasters rely on that airtime sale in order to make the programming and to, you know, be, you know, functioning companies. So there is no real incentive right now in the system to make any kind of racialized content, because there's no connection to what Numeris will do and what content will be created.
It sounds like your work is just happening on so many levels. It sounds like there's so many different paths to the work that you're doing, and such a lot to do. I did want to
just touch on the unions and guilds.
Please, yeah,
for a moment.
Yeah.
One, as you know, unions tend to be very nepotistic, and you know, it's who you know, who your father and grandfather were in terms of your role and the work that you do in the jobs that are controlled by those unions. And the barriers to access have been really significant. First of all, just being, people get hired because you know someone, and if you're not a part of that network, then you don't get in. And then there are also barriers to access in terms of how much it costs to get into those unions. And shockingly, I keep hearing from American producers, we can't find a Black makeup artist or a hairstylist. who we can work with, because they can only work with those who are in the unions. And you can imagine how many Black hairstylists and makeup artists there are in this country who would love to work in the industry, but it's made almost impossible for them to get in. And we are relying on those American producers to really keep putting the pressure on for the unions to find ways to open the doors and create access. And that's something that it's not even on my list of to-dos yet, but it's such a huge, important thing to do.
There are so many systemic issues here to confront all at once. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and that the Black Screen Office is doing. And thank you so much for being here at McMaster virtually for this conference. It's just a huge honor to have you here and to hear you speak about the Black Screen Office and your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks for the great questions.